Everyone. Thanks so much for being here. Welcome to Perilous Bounty, our book talk with Tom Philpott. I'm Lexi, a student fellow in the Law, Ethics, and Animals program here at Yale Law School. And before I introduce our guest, I wanted to say a bit about the organizations who are sponsoring the program today. The Law, Ethics, and Animals program is a multidisciplinary program at YLS. We aim to inspire impactful learning and scholarship about the deep legal, scientific, and moral questions that humanity's treatment of other animals raise. We also aim to empower Yale scholars and students to produce positive legal and political change for animals, people, and the environment upon which they depend. This event is part of our One Health speaker series, which explores the interconnectedness of ecosystem, animal, and human health. If you like this talk, you should sign up for our newsletter to receive word of future ones. Go to law.yale.edu/animals and click on Get Involved. You can also look up the Law, Ethics, and Animals program on YouTube to see videos of our past talks, or check out tinyurl.com/leap-YouTube. And we'll put all of these links in the chat so you don't have to remember them. Today's event is co-sponsored by the Yale Sustainable Food Program, which serves as a hub for creative and critical work on food and agricultural systems. The Yale Institute for Biospheric Studies, which is the umbrella environmental science center on campus. The Environmental Protection Clinic at Yale Law School, which is an interdisciplinary clinic that addresses environmental law and policy programs on behalf of client organizations. The Poynter Fellowship in Journalism, and two student organizations, the Yale Animal Law Society and the Yale Environmental Law Association. So it's my honor to introduce our speaker for today, Tom Philpott. He's a former farmer and the food and agriculture correspondent for Mother Jones, where he writes the Food for Thought blog online and contributes features and editorials to the bi-monthly print magazine. His work has been featured in the New York Times, Grist, Newsweek, The Guardian, and many other publications. Tom has been recognized with many honors, but to name just a few, Maverick Farms, which he co-founded in 2004, has been featured in Gourmet and the New York Times. In September 2008, Food and Wine named Tom one of the 10 innovators who will continue to shape the culinary consciousness of our country for the next 30 years. He's won a Gerald Loeb Award for Distinguished Business and Financial Journalism, and his blog Food for Thought was named Best Food Blog by the Association for Food Journalists. We're very lucky to have him here today to speak about his new book, Perilous Bounty, The Looming Collapse of American Farming and How We Can Prevent It. As I'm sure Tom will tell us in more detail, the book discusses a few seed and pesticide corporations and investment funds who are profiting off of dangerous trends in the food system. And he also features scientists, farmers, and activists who are charting a new path forward through resilient soil building and water smart farming practices. So thanks so much for being here today, and I'll turn it over to you, Tom.
Thank you so much, and sorry for this distraction of this animal, but we are, talking about ethics and animals. And he's not my emotional support animal per se, but if I don't have him here, he's going to be making a lot of noise. So thank you very much for having me. Thank everyone, and I also want to thank everyone for attending. And when I was thinking about this talk, the book came out in August, and I've had time to think about the book itself and the writing of it. And I was just reflecting about how when I started out on this project in 2017 or so, I was thinking about, the way that I was conceptualizing it was that this is going to be this when I focus on the two main production regions of U.S. agriculture, that being California, specifically mostly the Central Valley, and the Midwestern Corn Belt, centered around Iowa. These are the two sort of crucial nodes of food production in the United States. They're also crucial nodes in the global food system, and as I had already figured out by the time I started writing it, they were both in a state of ecological unwinding. They're both sort of in a state of ecological abuse, where the sort of ecological assets that they offer were literally being consumed in the process of producing our food. And so, I was thinking to myself, I'm not going to come out and spell it out in the book, but when people finish this book, It will be a damning critique of capitalist agriculture. And as I think about it more, sort of market-based agriculture, and as I think about it more, there really is no such thing as capitalist agriculture or free market agriculture, because the state is intimately involved from the very beginnings of United States agriculture in these regions, from the land grabs in the middle of the 19th century, to the infrastructure that has been built up, to several policies that we'll get to in this talk. And so what it really is about the state's management, the state's sort of overseeing of capitalist agriculture, and what role it plays, and what we get out of it. And is there a way to form an agriculture that doesn't just, basically socialize the costs and privatize the profits? Because that's the real structure of agriculture. It is not completely capitalist. So that's what be thinking about that as I talk, and maybe we can talk about that at the end. And something else I did in the process of researching the book was that I decided that I needed to keep the scope fairly narrow, or the book would just be too sprawling to sort of control. I would be working on it for the next 10 years. And so I've really focused on ecology, on the sort of use and abuse of land. And I didn't get too much. I do a little bit, but not too much into the costs that it imposes on people, mainly workers, and also people who live in these communities. And so I do start the book off with a note about how one of the key takeaways of the book is that this agriculture system that we have, as a sort of just as a precondition, it makes the areas where it alights most strongly, the Central Valley, the Corn Belt, into essential sacrifice zones. It basically, as a matter of course, makes these places really, really hard and unpleasant places to live in terms of things like air quality, water quality, social services, working conditions. And so that's a kind of a starting point. And I that comes out in the wash as I go through these areas, but I didn't get a chance. I would love to write a whole nother book about that. And I think this COVID-19 crisis has really ripped the veil off of that question in terms of meatpacking plants. Meatpacking plants were awful places to work before COVID-19 hit. They, basically destroy workers' bodies as a matter of course. Carpal tunnel and other repetitive stress injuries are prolific in these places, and those same conditions that made repetitive motion injuries prolific also make COVID-19 basically a deadly menace in these places. But so the focus, I don't focus on on workers. I just want to say that from the start, but it's something that we should keep in mind as we think about the food system. So I start off in California, that everyone on this call probably knows is the dominant source of fruits and vegetables in the United States. It's also a massive producer of obviously nuts. It's the dominant producer in the world of almonds, and one of the two dominant producers of pistachios. These are growing markets in all countries that have strong middle classes. Also, California is a massive producer of milk. Speaking of animal ethics, mostly on these enormous confined animal feedlots. And so I just want us to first, what I do in the book is I first acknowledge what an amazing environmental asset, ecological asset California is for growing food. It's one of the world's biggest, if not biggest, examples of a Mediterranean climate, which means basically mild winters and hot, dry summers. And the problem with Mediterranean climates is that you get this water scarcity. You get these big storms, but long stretches of dryness, and that can be a problem for agriculture, obviously. But California has got this asset that is incredible, and that is the Sierra Nevada mountains. And basically, the Sierra Nevada mountains, what they do is they capture almost all of the weather created in the South Pacific during the winter months. It almost all gushes into California, um, over the land, and hits the Sierra Nevada and drops as snow, and creates this incredible resource, the snowpack, that predictably melts in the spring, and provides this incredible irrigation resource, especially if you can capture it. And this gets back to the state involvement in agriculture there. There's been this incredible infrastructure, billions and billions of dollars, both federal and state, to create this infrastructure for capturing that snowmelt and meeting it out to farms. And 80% of that snowmelt goes to farms in the Central Valley. And so, what you get is this kind of, if anyone's ever farmed before, it's kind of a dream scenario, because one of the real, I've farmed here in the mid South and in the mountains of North Carolina, where you get really wet summers, and they're cool summers, and you can grow a lot of good stuff, but the constant rain creates disease. You never worry about infrastructure, although we did have years where, because of climate change, we would get long anomalous droughts in the summer. When I say a long drought in North Carolina, it's like maybe a month. So nothing compared to the epic droughts of California. But you get these, the constant rain creates all kinds of problems. You get your crops get damaged by the rain itself. You get fungal pathogens. Well, in California, you don't have that. You basically have this long, dry summer, and because of this incredible snowmelt resource, you essentially push a button and irrigate when you want to, and so you get the best of all worlds. And so it really is no surprise that California has emerged as this behemoth of agriculture. It's a great place to grow vegetables and fruits and things like nuts that require Mediterranean climates. It is it's one of the few places in the world where you can grow stuff like almonds and pistachios, and because of this water resource, there's no doubt that it's a great place to do that. The problem is that agriculture has gotten so big and so profitable over the course of the 20th century. And I should say one more thing about the 20th century. So this sort of agricultural dream I just laid out about this snowmelt being captured by the mountains and being, sort of in an orderly fashion doled out to these farms where they could push a button and irrigate as they wanted. The 20th century turns out to have been an anomalously wet century. And so there was just lots and lots of snowmelt. So as the American food system is evolving into this place where local and regional vegetable production ramps down everywhere else and ramps up dramatically in California, and you get this, massive public investment in infrastructure, it happened during an anomalously wet century. And we're already seeing a bit of a reversion to mean. And that's even like taking climate change out of the picture. What we've seen in the 21st century is more normal in California than what we saw in the 20th century in terms of wetness. So what you get is, you get this agriculture that sort of fattens on this easy access to water, the other source being the groundwater under the valley, that during inevitable dry years you can pump groundwater. So there's this huge well infrastructure throughout the valley. So what you get, especially coming into the 21st century, is an agriculture so big and so profitable and so ravenous for water that it's overstripped the resource of the Sierra Nevada. It's gotten bigger than the Sierra Nevada can handle, and so there's been this reversion to the pump, to the well, that was supposed to be sort of an insurance policy for bad years, but it's become another lifeblood for agriculture there. And then you add on to it less precipitation, less snow, and then you add on to that climate change, which means hotter summers, more evaporation, more need for water. And you get this situation that has become a bit of a race to the bottom of the well, to the bottom of the aquifer in California. You get this steady drop down, and these incredibly brutal droughts, like the one that we had in the first half of the 2010s, happen, and so that's basically the situation. And the government of California in 2014 shocked everyone by putting in its first ever groundwater law. So before that, California had the sort of old West style of, if you owned a piece of land, you could do whatever you wanted to it in terms of water. You could suck all the water out, even though it's actually a common resource under there. And so you got this race to the bottom of the well. You got incredible amounts of subsidence, where you got land sinking, snarling up infrastructure. So at the in the height of the drought, California puts this law into effect that all of the stressed aquifers of the state have to come into balance by 2040. And that sounds like a long way off, but basically it is going to if they actually enforce it, it's going to dramatically change California agriculture. And we're going to have, basically something like a sixth or a seventh of Central Valley agriculture will have to come out of production to create this balance. And that estimate from UC Davis is missing one factor, and that is that climate scientists, when they look at California and they look at its weather patterns, what they're observing is a long-term trend of shrinking snowpack, and we've already witnessed it. If you look at snowpack averages, they've been coming down for about like sort of the 5-year running average. So you're not using 1 year's drought to affect things. You're seeing a trend of declining snowpack, and climate models suggest that there could be, if things continue as they are in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, there could be no snowpack at all by the late 21st century, by let's say 2080, and severely shrinking before then. And so the food system that relies on fruits and vegetables and nuts and milk from California is going to have a reckoning. And I need to add one more thing to that. The same factors, I won't go into the science, but the same factors that make California super vulnerable to drought and declining snowpacks going forward also paradoxically make it super vulnerable to massive and, by our standards, unimaginable floods. And it turns out there was a flood in 1861, just after California gained statehood. The gold rush is petering out. They're trying to figure out what to do, how to diversify the economy. And in the winter of 1861, in December, it starts to rain, and a literal biblical 40 days and 40 nights situation comes into effect. And basically, the entire Central Valley comes under 20 feet of water. And that actually completely reordered. So it was this unimaginable catastrophe. It reorders California agriculture, because before that, the Central Valley was controlled mainly by Mexican farmers, Mexican nationals who had gained U.S. citizenship after the U.S. took the state. And they were, supplying beef to the gold rush, and also leather. It was fairly sparsely populated. Almost all cattle agriculture. It gets completely wiped out. And in kind of an example of the shock doctrine, the sort of white settlers who were jonesing after that land when the gold rush went bust, got the land from the Mexicans at pennies on the dollar, and basically took over agriculture, and decided it was too expensive to restock cattle, and shifted over to wheat and row crops, and began the sort of battle to harness the water resources of the Sierra Nevada, which were then free-flowing rivers. And that was sort of set the tone for the agriculture that we have today. So the flood sort of changed everything. And it's largely forgotten in California history. You can talk to really hardcore people who, native Californians who have basically never heard of it. But paleo scientists have looked at the sort of paleo record, checking out things like tree stumps and sediment in rivers and streams. And what they figure is that an event of that magnitude, actually much greater magnitude, happens every 100 to 200 years. And so the last one was 150 years ago. And so that's already disturbing. But then once again, the climate scientists come in and put climate models on top of that. And there's an incredible scientist at UCLA named Daniel, Daniel Swain. And his modeling, his research team figures that an event like that is more likely than not to happen in the next 20 years. And so imagine the Central Valley of today, which is now incredibly highly populated with booming cities in Fresno, Stockton, Bakersfield. These cities are seeing population growth as people flee the Bay Area and LA and their high rents. And then on top of that, this massive food production infrastructure, a storm flood event of that magnitude would be absolutely catastrophic. USGS modeling suggests that it would cause about $1 trillion, nearly $1 trillion in damage, which is 3 times the amount that a giant earthquake, the sort of next big one, would cost from the same team modeling it. Okay, so that's California. That is the sort of perilous bounty that we're getting from California, sort of dogged between drought and flood. And then we move in the book to the Corn Belt. And one of the things that I think about a lot is that California, like this dire situation that I've mentioned, I didn't even get into the horrible working conditions for farm workers there and the horrible living conditions, basically undrinkable water, people making $20,000 a year, buying all the water they drink, spending thousands of dollars on it because their home water is undrinkable. At least we're getting, fruits and vegetables and nuts, things that are sort of good for us to eat. When we go and shift to the Midwest, basically, as everyone knows, the 2 crops there are corn and soybeans. And I have a section in the book sort of teasing out what the diet is that we get from, putting this incredible, another incredible resource of land, the sort of Midwestern prairie, the sort of prairie-derived black soil of the Midwest being devoted to these crops. What we're getting for it is a bunch of additives. I talk about the place of corn oil and soybean oil in the U.S. diet. And basically those 2 oils dominate industrial food oil. I talk about high fructose corn syrup and other less famous corn sugars that make up a huge portion of our sugar consumption. Even though it's fallen off, it's still really big. And these are the sort of building blocks of processed food. And we're seeing, more and more research is coming out to show that the foods derived from these products are killing us, causing all kinds of public health crises, including, I would say, a big part of the COVID-19 public health crisis. I have a column coming out about that in the next issue of Mother Jones. And then also, obviously meat. And we know that feedlot meat has made it possible for the Americans to essentially have the highest meat consumption per capita in the world. There might be a couple of small countries that rival us. And one of the highest per capita meat consumptions in the history of the world. And there's plenty of public health data showing that it's not a good idea to eat more than a half pound of meat a day, that we should be eating less meat. And so the sort of product that we get for the ecological calamities that I'm about to describe is pretty, it's a pretty terrible bargain. It's a pretty bad way to run a food system. So what I show in the book is basically that since the settlers, the US settlers in the 19th century enclosed the land, evicted American Indians from it in violent fashion, and put it under the plow. Basically about a half of the store of topsoil, this incredible that formed over millennia of interactions between people and animals, and just the perfect climate, the sort of temperate Midwestern climate. It evolved this incredible store of topsoil, and we've burned through about half of it since U.S. settlement. And the thing is that there was this notion that basically exploded out into the world at the time of the Dust Bowl, that soil erosion was out of control, not just in the plains but also in the Midwest, and that conservation practices and conservation policies put into place by the USDA around the time of the New Deal basically sorted all of that out. And what I found out, and really kind of what made me want to write this book, was that it turns out that soil erosion is back with a vengeance. And the reason why it's back is essentially the incredible hegemony of corn and soybean agriculture, just the way that crop diversity in the Corn Belt over the years, especially since basically the 50s, has moved from a multi-crop rotation system where you had to grow some crops to feed the horses, and that was mainly hay. And then when you take the horses out, you don't need that anymore. And one thing leads to another, and suddenly you've got corn and soybeans as the only two major crops in the area, absolutely dominant. And the problem with that is, there are many problems with that, but one of the problems is that these crops are both planted and harvested at the same time. And so when you harvest them in the fall and then you wait until the spring to plant them, you've got these months in between the sort of late fall, winter, early spring months when the ground is essentially bare. And what happens is you get these heavy storms in the Midwest, and in that time, late winter, early spring, that you really want to have the ground covered for. And the reason is you want something growing in it. And the reason is that when that rain hits bare ground, it literally sends soil on the move. It creates these channels in the soil, these tiny channels, and that creates that as the water moves, it carries soil with it. And you also get these when the land has the right contour and the right shape. You get these little channels that develop, form massive gullies that carry soil away. And these two things combined turn out to create huge erosion. And so there's a scientist at Iowa State University named Richard Cruz, who I feature in the book, and he talks about, basically, if you look at the USDA data, what it tells you is at this point, erosion in Iowa is happening at a rate of about 5.4 tons per topsoil, and the natural replacement rate, the sort of weathering of between rocks and soil on top of it, creates about 5 tons of topsoil. And so we are losing topsoil at a unsustainable rate according to USDA, but it's fairly imbalanced. It's not a big immediate problem. And what Rick Cruz shows is that they are not counting that gully erosion. They're only counting the first kind, the tiny channels, but they're not counting the kind that comes with these giant gullies. And I happened, good for the book, bad for the planet, I happened to be able to go visit Rick a couple of years ago during an incredibly wet spring. It was actually the spring of 2019. They had this, these huge storms that basically started in March and didn't stop until June. And so I was able to drive around with them and witness these. They're called ephemeral gullies, and what they represent is they're like these gashes in the land that represent tons and tons of soil carried off of farms, along with their chemicals, their fertilizers and pesticides, into streams and downstream, causing all kinds of downstream damage. And what he says, what his research shows, that if you if you account for ephemeral gully, and it's not some conspiracy that the USDA is not counting it. It's that it's really, really hard to quantify. It's a lot harder to quantify than the normal sheet and rill erosion, it's called. But he's working on models, and he estimates that on average, with some years being horrific, like 2019, it's carrying away about 3 tons of topsoil extra per acre per year in Iowa, and so that brings the erosion rate up to over 8 tons
This
per
isn't
acre.
actually my work, but it's a book talk.
Yeah, someone needs to mute, I think. And so, so now we're at 8 tons of topsoil per acre. But what he says is that the 5-ton replenishment rate is basically fiction that's not based on very much at all, and that the best science shows that the actual rate of topsoil replenishment is more like a half an acre. And so what that means is we're losing topsoil not essentially at 5.4 to 5, essentially a 1-to-1 ratio, but more like a 16-to-1 ratio. And so what we're seeing, and he was already showing me last year parts of the field where you can see this is like, just empty fields besieged by rain for months and months, and little pathetic corn crop coming up because they got the corn in really late that year. And you can already see parts of the land that are gray instead of black. And those are areas, he explained, where the topsoil has already washed off. And you're already seeing, it's sort of hidden by the overall yield numbers, but you're already seeing massive and growing patches of the Midwest that are losing topsoil so much that their yields are really, really low. And basically, this situation cannot go on forever. You can't keep losing topsoil at a rate of 16-to-1. It's hard to get scientists to talk about like, well, how long can this go on? But he just, what Richard Cruz basically thinks is that the average is, you can muddle along with the average, but it's the extremes that get you. And so what this sets you up for is, eventually you're going to reach a point where if you get a drought, because poor soils, eroded soils, soils that are essentially a sublayer, they are super vulnerable to drought. The entire Midwest is rain. The entire Corn Belt, at least, is rain-fed agriculture. There's no irrigation infrastructure, and so they rely on rain. And ultimately, increasing droughts would cause catastrophic crop losses. And that's what he thinks is going to happen. Is it's not going to be the averages that get us. It's going to be really, really bad crop failures if we don't do something about this. And then there's also a really important climate change part of this problem, because the spring storms, late winter, early spring storms are the driver of the soil loss. And we're already seeing in the past half century significantly more than Midwest rain come in these spring storms, and they originate in the Gulf. As the Gulf of Mexico gets hotter, the water gets hotter, the air gets hotter, you get more evaporation, and you get more storms in this time period. We're already seeing a change. Someone who is farming now, who started in the 1970s, is farming in a different world. There are more of these storms and harsher storms. And once again, the climate models tell us that it only gets worse and worse. And so we're in a situation where we're leaving the soil bare there for setting it up perfectly for erosion when these storms hit. And there appears to be no change in policy on the horizon, at least right now. I mean, we're right before an election, so you never know. And then, in the rest of the section, I just sort of tease out, I asked the question, well, who benefits from this? Basically, farmers don't benefit very much because they are in hyper competition with each other. They're all growing the same product. The price of corn and soybeans tends to fall to exactly or below the cost of production. It's essentially a profit-free industry. One thing I wish I had gotten into the book is that, and so, basically subsidies is what keeps them afloat. Subsidized crop insurance and also direct payments from the government lets them eke out a margin. Where they do actually benefit, and I wish I had gotten into this into the book, is that there has been incredible land appreciation, land price appreciation. So if you're a farmer in Iowa, if you look at the sort of chart of land price appreciation, it has been for about 25 years a very steadily upward moving curve that fell a little bit when prices fell around 2013, 2014, but you're still way ahead of where you were 15 years ago. And that basically, that sort of land price appreciation, an investment will kick off, like a good stock investment with a dividend will kick off the dividend, which is paying you every year, and then the share price that you hope goes up and get at the end. And so this is like a stock that has a terrible dividend but great appreciation. And so what there is there's competition for that land. People want to buy that land and hope to cash in on it. And that's one of the things that drives, the ever bigger nature of farms, the consolidation of farms into fewer and fewer hands in the area. And so that I should have gotten that into the book, that farmers are compensated in land prices if you can hold on to the farm. There's obviously massive and steady farm loss in the Midwest ongoing today for half a century at least. But what I show in the book is that who ultimately benefits from the situation. We've got a terrible diet. We've got this weird farming, incredibly stressful farming business where it's really competitive, and your play is to sort of buy your neighbor's land. That's sort of the way that you get ahead. But who benefits from it is this set of companies that basically supply the gold rush. No one made money in the gold rush, but the suppliers of shovels and picks are who cashed in. And so the companies that supply this system, where there's this constant scramble for higher yields, there's this constant narrowing to more and more corn and soybeans. If you're a seed supplier or a pesticide supplier, then you benefit. I sort of lay out in the book how those two industries, seeds and pesticides, that used to be completely separate, and no major corporation would want to get into seeds. It was a sleepy business dominated by local and regional players. When GMOs, just talk about how when GMO technology came around, it became very important to, there was there's this idea that we'll just sort of be software suppliers. We'll create the traits and sell them to seed companies. And there was this quick realization that to maximize profits, they needed to own the seeds as well. So you get Monsanto and DuPont, going in and buying up all the seed purveyors in the 1980s and 90s, especially the 90s, and merging these businesses into a business that basically uses seeds as a loss leader to sell traits and to sell pesticides. And it's no mistake that that basically all but one of the, there's BT corn, which is the corn with a pesticide engineered into it. But everything else is really herbicide tolerance, and the same companies sell you the herbicide. And I go in and talk in the book about the pesticide treadmill that it's put farmers on, the rise of pesticide or herbicide resistance that's happening to this day, in incredible crisis in the Midwest of herbicide resistance and the various poisons that farmers are putting down to control them. And basically, and I talk in the book about how big section of Monsanto, which is now owned by Bayer, and how they always sort of are having their investors and the general public look off into the horizon at these incredible products that we're going to have, in the future. They're 5 years away. And meanwhile, their main product is herbicide tolerant crops. And Bayer, its agriculture division now, is completely hinges on soybean and cotton seeds that are engineered to resist not one, not two, but 3 herbicides. And one of those herbicides is called dicamba, and it's got this problem that it can't stay in place. It volatilizes. When it's applied, it tends to vaporize in the air and get carried in the wind over to the neighbor. And so you see this incredible off-target damage, not just of crops that aren't engineered to withstand it, but also yards and lawns and gardens and the fruit and vegetable farms that do exist in the Midwest live in a state of fear of getting crop damage from wafting pesticides. And just yesterday, the director of the EPA, Andrew Wheeler, showed up in Georgia, which is a purple state, and there's a lot of soybeans and cotton in Georgia, and farmers that want to use this stuff, despite what it does to their neighbors. And he defied a court order that had vacated the registration for this dicamba product and re-registered it for 5 years. This just happened yesterday. And so that basically puts the Midwest in this real bad pinch of using, not one, not two, but 3 herbicides on crops, and some of those herbicides not staying in place. And so who knows how that's going to go, but it's going to be really bad and stressful, and end up with a lot of pesticides walking around, not just in the air, but also seeping into water and poisoning water. And just as there is a massive water crisis in the Central Valley in terms of people not having access to clean water, the water crisis in the Midwest is reaching comical proportions. Basically fertilizers and I get into it in the book, but I didn't talk about it here. The rise of giant hog farms, peppering the Midwest, concentrated in certain counties in Iowa. That their concentrated manure seeps into water and is just creating all kinds of problems downstream, and just sort of making life miserable for people who live in this area. And so just, I talk in the book about how there is every market you look at that serves corn and soybean farmers, from their input suppliers who I've talked about, but also their buyers, the sort of grain trading firms like Archer Daniels Midland and Cargill, to the meat companies that buy huge amounts of corn and soybeans as feed. They're all completely consolidated. 3 or 4 companies dominate the markets, and they capture the value that emerges from the Midwest, that emerges from this incredible store of topsoil. And what they do for it in exchange for capturing the value is give us a really crappy, really kind of a catastrophically bad diet. I was just looking at a study suggesting that 88% of Americans have a metabolic condition, from high blood pressure to high blood sugar, diabetes, pre-diabetes, and a huge portion of that, part of it is our sedentary lifestyle, but a huge portion of that comes down to this highly processed, meat-centered diet. How am I doing on time? Do I need to switch it over to questions?
Yeah, whenever you're ready. I think we can stay on till 1:30 if that works for you, or we can wrap up at 1:15.
Yeah, so let me just real briefly talk about, I think I can summarize my sort of obligatory solutions chapter after I laid out these massive festering crises. And my solution ends up just being that these end up being political problems. It's about the power of these companies. And in California, the giant sort of, a wonderful almond company is a big driver of some of the terrible water politics, super politically connected. All the companies and input suppliers and buyers and meat companies that I mentioned are also massively politically connected. They're very smartly take some of the profits that they generate and invest them in lobbying and campaign finance. And they've completely dominated the sort of terms of debate around the Farm Bill, which is what props up the whole system, basically sort of keeping farmers afloat in this, sort of permanent crisis that they live in. This, sort of prices, because there's so much overproduction. And I talk about how Brazil and Ukraine, like Brazil already has, and Argentina have taken some incredibly important ecological assets in their territories and turned them over to this extractive corn and soybean production, which is not only destroying the ecologies of those areas, but putting the Midwest under ever greater pressure, because now there's all these corn and soybeans coming from Brazil and Argentina. The same thing is happening in Ukraine, which has, you know, one of the other great stores of black soil from just this combination of environment and ecology over millennia that is now going under the plow for corn and soybeans for the international market. And so it's the same companies, the same handful of meat companies and input suppliers and grain traders are operating in the Midwest and Argentina and Brazil and Ukraine. And they have an incredible political power. And so I end the book, I finished writing when Bernie Sanders was a front runner, or at least was doing really well in the campaign. Elizabeth Warren was also a viable candidate. And I think that the only solutions to the problems that I raised in the book are political. And it's coming up with a way, whether it's getting people out into the street, whether it's electing progressive candidates to elections in Congress and in the White House. The only way to change things is through politics. We have to do politics. And I talk about, you know, Michael Pollan has a line, I quote a line from Michael Pollan from just after his book was published, where he sees this, what he calls a movement as market. He goes to the farmer's market in Manhattan, Union Square, and sees this packed farmer's market, and right across there's this gleaming, almost cathedral-like Whole Foods that's also packed, and figures, hey, this is it. It's 2005. Consumers care about where their food's going to come from. We're going to transform the food system. And I know that 15 years on, that movement hasn't gone anywhere, but neither has the industrial food system. We now have two food systems, one for well-off people and one for everyone else. And we need, for very, very many reasons, not least which is the ecological problems I talk about, we have to transform that. And I feel like it's going to be policy change that does that. And so with that, why don't I stop talking and open it up for questions?
Amazing. So I have a couple of questions for you, and then I'll start calling on people from the audience. But you were just talking about sort of political change. And I know that a lot of federal progressive efforts, especially in the environmental space, have been on the defensive during the Trump administration, and a lot of innovation has moved to kind of the local and state level in policy design. And you mentioned Andrew Wheeler's recent defiance of a court order on herbicides, and then also California's recent aquifer legislation that could potentially be transformative. So I wondered if there's been a similar trend to local politics in the agriculture space, and if you see any of that changing if Biden is elected next week.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And I think the answer is yes. And what I do talk about in the book is that we need to have a process of de-Californication of the fruit and vegetable system. My editor he thought that was just too inelegant of a phrase, but that's the basic idea. And it isn't like stopping getting food from California because it's a great place to grow food. It's just de-emphasizing it, maybe making California more of a regional powerhouse than a global powerhouse. And what that means is ramping up food production, fruit and vegetable production everywhere else in the United States. And I think we are seeing lots of great policies around that. I'm speaking in November to the Ohio Food Policy Council, which is figuring out, it's in the middle of the Corn Belt, or at least on its eastern edge, and they're trying to figure out how they can support efforts to ramp up food production, and what can be done at the state level to incentivize food production that can get local fruits and vegetables out of not just being a sort of farmers market niche, but get them into schools, into hospitals, into the supermarket. And we are seeing that, and I think it's really important. And I think most areas in the United States are trying to do that. And I think that the big structural problem, and I talk about this in the book, is that the prices of California fruits and vegetables are so low that it's really hard to get over. Like, you'll get a school system that says, hey, we'd love to buy local produce from you, but you've got to beat this price. This is, we have a really tight budget. We're a school, we have an awful, reimbursement rate from the federal government for our food purchases. And we would love to buy your local spinach, but here's a California price. And that just, because of economies of scale, because of, California's California farmers' ability to exploit labor, being situated right by Mexico is a massive example. Although that too is getting problematic. I talk about in the book how that resource that has been crucial to California agriculture since the very beginning in the U.S., basically exploited labor from Mexico, is getting trickier and trickier. And the main reason is that the state is, basically forcing farms to basically join the 1940s and pay rising minimum wages, overtime, all those labor protections and benefits that came about in the New Deal excluded farm workers. And California, the legislature is moving away from that model, and that is putting California farmers in a real pinch and in the uncomfortable place of having to say, we can't be profitable unless we can, not follow federal labor law, unless we can cling to this exception that we have. So I think that's one of the big problems is that that those efforts are limited by the California price. And then in these Corn Belt states, I hate to say that state legislatures and governorships tend to be completely sort of captured by agribusiness, and we see very little progressive policy movement in those places. What we do see are social movements of people rising up and saying, no, I don't want a 5,000 hog CAFO in my town or down the street from me, and that is causing problems. And I think that kind of movement can be leveraged if progressive politicians can take over in those states. And sorry about my dog.
No problem at all.
It's not the little one, it's my other dog. Okay.
I'll shift to some of the questions from the chat since we have a lot of great questions coming up. I think Liam had a question that followed on directly from your last answer, asking if shifting away from California could potentially increase carbon emissions from heating crops in colder climate greenhouses.
I don't think it has to. I mean, I think you could do it all kinds of different ways. California is obviously a great place to grow winter vegetables, and so you could. There's a great study that came out of Iowa State that I cite in the book that says that with the right policies in place, the Midwest, the Corn Belt, essentially could be self-sufficient in a bunch of popular fruits and vegetables in the growing season, which is, let's say, May until October or something like that. And so you could focus on those months. You could build up food production in those months and then rely on California for the winter months, and you're still way ahead of the game. And I think there's also lots of great greenhouse technology, season extension technology that's low tech or at least low energy input that you can do. There's a phenomenal farmer up in Maine named Elliot Coleman who grows grows vegetables throughout their winter. And what he told me once is that just putting a simple cover on, like a sort of cloth cover over your vegetables, every time you do that, you're going 1,000 miles south. So he's in Maine, he puts one on, and he goes down to, I don't know, North Carolina. And I'm just making these mileages up. And he puts another one on, and he's down in Florida. And so, you can grow stuff like carrots and, all kinds of greens, cooler vegetables all winter long with stuff like that. And so I think you can increase winter production without having a greenhouse gas explosion, and then really increase, growing season production without having a big greenhouse gas expense.
Great, thank you. We had another question from Brian asking if there's a reason that farmers don't plant seasonal cover crops to try to prevent soil erosion if they know that that's going to happen and potentially affect their future yields.
Yes, that's a great question. Major topic of conversation and debate in the Corn Belt these days. And I think that, basically farmers, so cover crops, I should say, are growing. They are expanding. And if you talk to the Farm Bureau, they'll tell you that cover crops are expanding 20% year on year. Everything's fine. Nothing to see here, move along. We've got this under control. But they're expanding from a tiny base. And so you've got like maybe 3 or 4% coverage in the Midwest. And I think there's signs that the growth is slowing, that is plateauing at 3 or 4%, which obviously is not sufficient. And I just think that they end up being an added expense without an immediate return. And this industry is so, if you're a farmer, your immediate expenses are super, super important. And, we're also seeing, the 3 or 4% that we have there is compensation for it. Apparently the compensation rates aren't high enough to make it move in any like significant way. And if you do the math, the compensation that it would take would be pretty expensive. And so I think that is the main reason. And also there are legitimate ecological things like in the northern Corn Belt, getting a cover crop established before the winter, after the harvest, before the winter comes on, can be really tricky. And so I think we also have to think beyond cover crops into crop diversification. And I have a farmer in the book who is, his name is Tom Philpott, and he is doing lots of winter rye, which is a crop that was grown in the Corn Belt for a while and could be grown again, and it grows all winter. And so if you have a third of your land in winter rye, now you've got a third of your land covered in the winter, and that's a massive net benefit. And also it helps cover cropping because winter rye is it is harvested a lot earlier than corn and soybeans. So when you pull your rye up, you can plant. You have plenty of time to plant cover crops that you can take into the next season for your corn and soybean rotation. It's just a much better rotation. And crop diversification, I think, is the real answer, and along with cover crops. And it's just really hard because the whole system is geared to corn and soybeans. That's what the market wants. There isn't a lot. You can use rye to feed your own animals, but no one has animals anymore unless you own a bunch of CAFOs. The animals have all gone inside. And so it seems like at the end of the day, what they have to do is figure out a way to get animals back on the land, out of these CAFOs. And if you do that, it just opens up all of these possibilities for crop rotations, for animals coming through and foraging on crops. And I think that ends up being the answer, with cover crops being part of the solution, but not the only solution. I hope that answers the question. It is a vexing problem that people are talking a lot about in the Midwest.
Yeah, on the subject of sort of crop diversification and winter crops, Tim had a question about what New England can do to become more self-sufficient in grain. And he was curious whether you're familiar with some of the movement within New England to kind of re-autonomize their local food systems.
Yes, I think New England is definitely a leader in that. And I am familiar with these alternative grain systems where, I remember years ago going to the farmer's market in Brooklyn after I moved away from there, but probably around 2010, and seeing, farmers market stands with not only flowers, but also stuff like wheat berries. And I think all of that is super important. And I don't even get into the book the various crises in wheat farming that are also dire. A giant aquifer in the Midwest, whose name I can never pronounce. So I'm not going to try, but everyone probably knows what it is. Agalala, I think is how you say it. I ventured it anyway. That's being drawn down at a rate that rivals the aquifers in the Central Valley. And there's been no great legislative effort to save that. And so those efforts are super, super important. And I think that, that New England has its winter vegetable guru in Elliot Coleman. And I think putting public policy behind those efforts, figuring out what farmers need. If there is a grain renaissance happening in the Midwest, then policymakers should say, okay, how can we strengthen this? What do farmers need? What infrastructure do farmers need to make this even more pronounced? If people are doing winter vegetables like Elliot Coleman, again, what grants can we give? And I think that there's been a lot of thought recently that I don't get into in the book about moving beyond the farmers market. It's stuff like farmer-owned retail. It doesn't have to be the farmers manage. Farmers don't know anything about managing retail, but there could be a farmer cooperative that owns retail that hires a manager, a professional manager, and more food dollars stay within the growing community and can go through the community, and wages for farm workers could be higher. There's also, like anywhere else, there's a farm labor exploitation problem in New England. But I just think sort of asking the question of what is going on here in terms of movements to relocalize and regionalize agriculture, and how can policy step in and help scale them up, I think is the key question. And I think the answers are there. It's just coming up with policy resources. And I know that New England is one of the most progressive areas. Shelley Pingree is from there, incredible rep from Maine, who's also an organic farmer herself. So there's lots of great resources there. And I think just figuring out how to put policy in places to strengthen these efforts is crucial.
Great. So I think we have time for maybe a couple of more questions. Lauren had a question about if local drinking water sources are seeing significant nitrate pollution in the Corn Belt from all the inputs being used there. And she also wondered whether pollution is more likely in years where there's heavy spring flooding.
Yes and yes. Massive pollution problems. Des Moines, the city of Des Moines is downstream from two rivers, relies on these two rivers for its drinking water, and runs the world's biggest denitrifier to make that water potable, drinkable. And so the people of Des Moines are paying the cost of removing these pollutants. Wells throughout the area are routinely polluted with high nitrate levels. The charismatic megafauna of pollution from the Corn Belt is the Gulf of Mexico's giant algae bloom that is nitrogen fed, but there's also, massive phosphorus fed algae blooms throughout the area in lakes. And those cause huge problems they create a toxin that absolutely haunts the city of Toledo. If you Google Toledo and blue-green algae and my name, but you don't even have to put my name in there. There's loads of material about that out there, and there's some in my book. So the answer is yes, and it actually, a bunch of spring storms can help the Gulf of Mexico by diluting the amount of nitrogen that gets in, and you can get smaller dead zones. But for the rest of the area, more runoff means more pollution, more algae blooms. So yes.
Great. I think for our last question, we had two sort of related issues about funding in this space. One is from Austin. He says, your book engages with a lot of research from land grants. What's your research advice in engaging with these schools, given the corporate dollars sloshing around, especially with looming budget crises relating to COVID-19? And then Viveka asked a question that's sort of related about what the funding landscape is like for agriculture investigative journalists today. Compared to many other industries, it seems like there are very few young journalists in the field and who are focused on illuminating the abuses of big ag. And in recent years, have you seen more funding or prioritization of investigative reporting into agribusiness?
Wow, great questions. First one, I am always surprised at the sort of rogue scientists that I find at the land grants. They tend, I mean, they actually come in all ages, because the older ones are nurturing grad students that are doing great work. But I think that the question is putting its finger on a definite crisis. They're definitely marginalized. They definitely are going against the grain, so to speak. It's probably not a great career move in general. And so I think, definitely we need to do more. Journalists like me need to do more work showing the influence of I've done a little bit, but showing the influence of agribusiness in these areas, because it is massive. If you go to ISU, there's the Monsanto this and the DuPont that, just walking around looking at who's funding the halls and endowing the professorships. So absolutely crucial problem. And it's true. So much of my book is Davis research, ISU research, just incredible. One of the whistleblowers who kind of showed that glyphosate was not going to be a miracle herbicide in the Midwest and sort out all the problems. I just talked to today, named Barb Hartzler, was writing that in the 90s, and he's still, telling it like it is. And I think these folks are very marginalized, and that's a problem. Investigative journalism on agriculture in general, like the rest of the journalism industry, it's a giant market failure. If I've only written about food politics in my career for nonprofit publications, Grist and Mother Jones as my employers, and I can say that my job wouldn't exist if we weren't a nonprofit and didn't get if we relied on advertisements for my work. I would be pushing a broom right now, or working as a cook in a steakhouse or something like that. And so it is a giant market failure. We have seen a lot of great developments. I think there is this realization how important it is. And there's a thing called the Food and Environment Reporting Network, FERN, that has, basically I kind of helped found it, and now it's sort of, out on its own, doing a lot of great things and gathering money from foundations and donors and putting it to really crucial journalism. I should say that really one of the great examples of journalism going on right now in terms of the COVID-19 crisis is Leah Douglas for FERN, who's been tracking deaths and COVID-19 cases among meatpacking workers. And that's FERN. It's not the private industry. It's not the sort of private journalism model that's funding it. I don't think there's a special problem with the particular public service journalism that we do in talking about the food system. I think it's general, that anything that's not generating loads of clicks or page views and ad views is in a severe crisis right now, and we need progressive funders, progressive rich people, to do what the right wing did in the 70s, starting the 70s and 80s, and dumping loads and loads of money into media, and ultimately creating Fox News, and creating this sort of like infrastructure that generates journalists that can go and be in front of the camera at Fox News. I think progressive funders need to realize that they need to fund journalism as well that reports on these issues that, if there's not outside funding, isn't going to get reported on. So that's my answer to that question. Was there a third one in there?
No, I think that covered it.
Okay.
Well, thank you again so much for being here, Tom. This was incredibly informative, and I definitely encourage everyone to check out Perilous Bounty if you enjoyed hearing about this talk. A reminder to everyone that this event will be posted on YouTube, so you and your friends can relive it and check it out. And we would also love to encourage you to sign up for the LEAP newsletter. I'm dropping the link in the chat now so that you can sign up and hear about our future events. So thanks again to Tom and to everyone who's in attendance today.
Thanks, everyone.